All right, so get ready because today we're really diving into something fascinating, Lebanese politics.
Oh, yeah.
This is a listener request. Someone specifically asked us to unpack this. And let me tell you, it is complicated.
Hmm.
We're looking at a Wikipedia article that a listener sent over, and it's dense.
Yeah.
So get your thinking caps on.
Yeah, Lebanon's system is really, it's unique. It tries to balance a democracy with this thing called confessionalism.
Okay, confessionalism. So, like, are we talking confession booths? What are we talking?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a system where the highest offices in the government, they're reserved for specific religious communities.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so the president has to be from a certain religion, prime minister another, the speaker of parliament another. It's a real balancing act, trying to make sure all the major groups are represented.
Okay, so it's like baked into the system.
Exactly.
This power-sharing agreement based on religion.
Yes.
But how did this even come about? Has it always been this way in Lebanon?
Well, to understand that, we got to go back a bit.
Okay.
Modern Lebanon, it was founded by the Maronite Christians and the Druze
Okay.
back in the 18th century.
18th century, okay.
And now fast forward to 1943, that's when they had this thing called the National Pact.
Okay.
And that essentially formalized this confessional system.
So they said, let's make this official.
Yeah, they were like, we're going to make this, the rule of the land. And that agreement, it was later reaffirmed in 1989
Okay.
with the TAFE agreement. And the goal, maintain peace, make sure everyone felt like they had a seat at the table.
Peace through power sharing, I guess. Sounds good on paper, but does it, like, actually work?
Well, that's where this troika system comes in.
Troika. Okay, now there's another word.
I know, right? So picture this. You've got the president, always a Maronite Christian.
Okay.
Then you've got the prime minister, always a Sunni Muslim.
Okay.
And to round it out, the speaker of parliament, always a Shia Muslim.
So it's like each of them has their own little piece of the pie.
Exactly. Each holding a piece of that political puzzle.
But it seems like that could lead to some, like, serious gridlock. What if they can't agree on stuff?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right.
Right. Does it lead to cooperation or just constant bickering? You see, it's like a three-legged stool, this troika system.
Okay.
If one leg weakens the whole thing, it becomes unstable.
That makes sense.
Right.
So in this system, in this troika, who's really calling the shots?
That is a great question.
Because, I mean, it's still a democracy, right?
Yeah.
They have a parliament, they have a prime minister. So where does the power really lie?
You'd think with a parliament and a prime minister, it'd be kind of like business as usual.
Right.
But the Lebanese presidency, it's surprisingly strong.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Even with this whole, like, semi-presidential setup.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The president, they don't just get a fancy title. We're talking real power here. They appoint the prime minister.
Wow.
They can dismiss the entire government if they want to.
Right.
And in general, they just wield a lot more influence than you might think. It's a position with teeth.
Wow. Okay, so the president's a big deal. What about the prime minister and the cabinet? Are they just taking orders?
Well, the TAFE agreement, remember that from 1989?
Right.
It did try to shift some power towards the Council of Ministers
Okay.
to give them more say in decision-making.
Right, so they're not just like puppets.
Trying to give them a little more autonomy. But realistically, the president still holds a lot of cards.
Yeah.
Let's not forget, they picked the prime minister, they picked the cabinet.
Right. Of course. Okay, so it's a balance, but maybe the president's side of the scale is a little heavier than the others?
You could say that.
Okay, what about the lawmaking side of things? Tell me about their parliament.
Ah, the parliament. Or, as it's formally known, the Assembly of Representatives.
Fancy.
They've got 128 seats,
Okay.
split evenly between Christians and Muslims. And each seat, it represents a certain denomination within those faiths.
So it's not even just Christian Muslim, it's like specific branches within.
Exactly. Now, here's where it gets interesting. While those seats are assigned based on these religious groups,
Okay.
they're elected by, get this, universal suffrage.
So everyone gets a vote.
Everyone gets a vote.
But how do you balance that with assigned seats? That seems like it could lead to some, well, tension, maybe even manipulation.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really good point. And you're right. This system, it has definitely had its share of criticism. There have been accusations of gerrymandering.
Which is what, just for anyone who's not familiar?
That's where they're drawing the districts to favor certain groups.
Okay.
Right. And there are definitely concerns about whether certain communities are actually being represented fairly. So, yeah, it's definitely a system that's still evolving.
There's always more than meets the eye. especially with a system as, like, complex as Lebanon's.
Absolutely. And we haven't even gotten to the judicial branch yet.
Okay, so let's not leave the courts hanging. What's the deal with their judicial system? Is it, like, a similar structure to other democracies?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk courts. I'm guessing it's not just as simple as, like, guilty, not guilty in a system like Lebanon's.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not that straightforward. It's this really fascinating mix of structures you'd find in other places, but then with some very unique Lebanese elements added in.
Okay, so walk me through it.
All right, so at its heart, you have this three-tiered system, kind of like a pyramid, right?
Okay.
So at the very top, you've got the Court of Cassation. That's kind of like the Supreme Court you see in other countries.
Okay, so that's for the big final decisions.
Exactly, the top of the food chain, legally speaking. Then below that, you've got the Courts of Appeal.
Okay, so if you lose, you move up the pyramid.
Exactly. And then at the bottom, the base of the pyramid, you've got the Courts of First Instance, which is where the cases are initially heard.
So that's where it all starts.
Exactly.
Okay, familiar structure so far, but knowing Lebanon, I'm guessing there's got to be some kind of twist.
Oh, there's always a twist in Lebanese politics.
Right.
So in addition to this whole pyramid structure, Lebanon also has these special courts.
Special courts, what are those for?
So first, you've got the Constitutional Council.
Okay.
Their whole job is to make sure that any law that gets passed, it's actually allowed under the Constitution.
Checks and balances.
Exactly. Then there's the Supreme Council. And get this, they handle any charges against the president and the prime minister.
Wait, so there's a whole separate court just for if the president or the prime minister gets in trouble?
That's right.
That's kind of intense.
Well, it just shows you how sensitive those positions are within the Lebanese system.
Yeah, for sure.
And then, to make it even more interesting, they also have military courts.
Okay, so those are probably just for, like, military offenses, right?
Well, they can be, but believe it or not, they can also have jurisdiction over civilians in certain cases.
What? Like, what kind of cases?
We're talking things like espionage, treason,
Oh, wow.
high-stakes stuff.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to mess around with the law in Lebanon, it sounds like.
It's a whole different ball game over there.
Right. But I have a feeling that the real story of Lebanese politics, it probably goes, like, even deeper than all these formal structures, right? It can't just be about laws and courtrooms.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And this is where things get really interesting. You see, even with this whole intricate system of power sharing, of representation, a lot of times it's actually the powerful families and the local allegiances that end up holding more sway than the actual political parties themselves.
So it's like, it's not what you know, it's who you know,
Mhm.
but on a, like, national scale.
Precisely. You've got this whole web of personal connections, loyalties, running throughout their entire political landscape. It's fascinating, really.
So you're not just picking a party, you're picking a whole network.
Exactly. And speaking of parties, get ready for a wild ride. Because there are a ton of them.
Oh boy, here we go.
And a lot of times they reflect those religious affiliations we talked about earlier.
So it's not like a simple two-party system like we see in some other democracies.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the Christian side. You've got groups like the Free Patriotic Movement, the Kehhed Party, they're sometimes called the Phalange. You've got the National Bloc, the National Liberal Party, the Lebanese Forces. And then historically, there were the Guardians of the Cedars, although they're actually outlawed now.
Okay, so that's a lot.
And that's just the Christian side. Now, on the Muslim side, you've got major players like Amal movement and Hezbollah. They're especially powerful within the Shia community. And then, of course, you've got the Progressive Socialist Party, a leading Druze party.
Okay, I need like a flow chart to keep track of all of this.
Right. It's a lot.
But you were saying earlier that even with all these parties, it's not always about like strictly following a certain party line.
Exactly. I mean, some parties, they definitely have strong ideological followings.
Right.
But oftentimes, it's more about loyalty to specific leaders, to deep-rooted community ties. Think of it less about the actual political platform and more about just supporting the figures and the groups that represent your community, your family, your interests.
So it's very personal.
Very personal, very nuanced.
Okay. So how does this system, with its whole emphasis on religious representation and everything, how does it handle disagreements? I mean, there's got to be some challenges there, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely not a system without its flaws.
Right.
There are some inherent tensions that come with trying to balance a democracy with this deeply ingrained system of religious representation.
So where do the cracks start to show? What are like the biggest points of contention? So where do the cracks start to show? What are like the biggest points of contention?
Well, a lot of the debate revolves around confessionalism itself.
Right, because not everyone's going to agree with that system.
Exactly. Like you have some Christian groups, for example, that are pushing for more decentralization of power.
Okay, so they want, like, less power in the central government, more in the hands of local communities?
Exactly. They argue that it would give them more autonomy.
Right, so they can kind of run things their own way. Makes sense.
Right, more of a say in how their own communities are run. But then, on the other hand, you have a lot of Muslims, both Sunni and Shia.
Okay.
They tend to favor a more unified government, more centralized. But even they say that the current power-sharing agreement, it needs to be adjusted.
To reflect how things have changed.
Exactly. They argue that it doesn't really reflect the country's demographics anymore.
Right, because things have changed since the 1930s or whenever the last time they did a census was.
Exactly. And speaking of the census, get this. There hasn't been a census in Lebanon since 1932.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, 1932.
That's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago, which makes it really difficult to have these informed discussions about, okay, how do we reform this system? How do we update it based on how many people are actually in each group? We don't really know the actual numbers.
That's like trying to bake a cake without knowing how much flour you have.
Exactly.
It's not going to turn out well.
It's a recipe for disaster. Right. And then on top of all of that, we have to remember that there's another group that we haven't even talked about yet, and that's the Palestinian refugees.
Right, because there's a sizable Palestinian population in Lebanon, right?
Huge. And they're largely excluded from this whole system.
So where does that leave them in terms of their day-to-day lives?
Well, it means they face a lot of challenges, a lot of limitations. It's a very complex situation, and it adds this whole other layer of complexity to the whole question of representation and rights within Lebanon.
Right, because their voices aren't really being heard in the current setup.
Exactly.
Okay, so with all of this going on, with all these complexities, these competing interests, are there any recent developments, anything that might give us a clue about where Lebanese politics is headed?
Absolutely. The 2022 parliamentary election, big changes there. Hezbollah and its allies, they lost their majority in parliament.
Wow, that's a big deal.
First time in a while, a real turning point. Now, to be clear, Hezbollah itself, they didn't actually lose any of their own seats.
Okay.
Their allies did, which weakened their hold overall.
So it wasn't like a total rejection of Hezbollah, but maybe a sign that people are, I don't know, looking for something different.
Could be. And what's more, we saw a lot of newer, reform-minded parties, independent candidates. They gained a lot of seats.
Interesting. So that suggests that change is coming from, like, the ground up.
Potentially, especially from the younger generation. There's a real hunger for alternatives.
Okay. So what about the older parties, the more established ones? How do they fare in all of this?
Well, President Owen's Free Patriotic Movement, they were a Hezbollah ally. They actually lost their position as the largest Christian party.
Oh, wow. So the old guard is being challenged.
It seems so. And then there's the Future Movement, which is a prominent Sunni party led by Saad Hariri. They actually boycotted the entire election.
They just sat it out.
Completely, which left a real vacuum in Sunni representation.
So much change in just one election cycle. I mean, it really sounds like Lebanon is at a crossroads.
Absolutely. Grappling with its past, trying to figure out what its future is going to look like.
So much to think about. We've really unpacked a lot here.
Right.
We talked about this unique system that Lebanon has, this blend of democracy and confessionalism.
Right, trying to balance those competing forces.
Exactly. We looked at the balance of power, how it's distributed between the president, the prime minister, the parliament.
And we can't forget the courts.
Oh, right, the courts, with all their complexities. And then we got into the weeds of the political parties, the families, the religious allegiances, all of these things that really shapes the political landscape in Lebanon.
And how those allegiances sometimes matter more than the actual party platforms.
Absolutely. And to top it all off, we ended on a note of change, with these recent elections suggesting that maybe, just maybe, things are starting to shift. It's a lot to take in, but it's so important to understand these nuances.
It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding the why, the how, the motivations behind the system, and how it plays out in the lives of everyday people.
Exactly. So if this deep dive has piqued your interest, if you're sitting there thinking, wow, I need to know more, don't stop here.
There's a whole world of information out there.
Read up on those 2022 elections. Look for different perspectives, different viewpoints on everything we've discussed.
And don't be afraid to go beyond the headlines. delve into the history, the culture, the people of Lebanon.
This is how we become more informed, more engaged citizens of the world. So, till next time, this is The Deep Dive. Signing off, keep those brains engaged.